Nietzsche made one historical comparison in the Antichrist that cuts deeper than anything else he wrote about Christianity, and most people who quote him have never read it. In section 60, he contrasted Moorish Spain with the Crusades, not as a ranking of civilizations, as evidence of a specific internal contradiction in Christian moral history, one that the tradition has neither fully acknowledged nor adequately resolved. That contradiction is the subject of this video, and it is more uncomfortable the closer you look at it. Here is what Nietzsche actually wrote in the Antichrist, section 60. He described the cultural achievement of Arab civilization in medieval Spain, specifically what was established in Andalusia between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries. He wrote of what he called noble and masculine instincts in that civilization's intellectual and artistic output, referring to the universities, the libraries, the preservation and advancement of Greek philosophy, medicine, and mathematics that took place there while much of Northern Europe was intellectually static by comparison. He then contrasted this with what came after. When the Reconquista, the Christian campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula, succeeded, he wrote of the destruction of the libraries, the burning of manuscripts, the systematic dismantling of what had been built. Nietzsche's claim was not that Christianity is generically violent. His claim was specific. The institution that had built its entire moral framework on the condemnation of strength, pride, and destructive self-assertion as the cardinal sins. That same institution sanctified exactly those qualities when they were directed toward expanding its own authority. The crusading knight who burned a library was not violating Christian morality. He was enacting it, in the name of it, with the full blessing of the institution. That, Nietzsche argued, is the contradiction that cannot be explained away. The historical context needs to be accurate, because Nietzsche's argument depends on it. Moorish Spain, Al-Andalus, was not a paradise or a morally simple entity. It was a medieval Muslim civilization with the full complexity that implies, including its own hierarchies, its own treatment of non-Muslim minorities, and its own internal conflicts. Nietzsche was not presenting it as a perfect society. What he was pointing to was a specific historical fact. It produced, during a specific period, intellectual output of genuine and lasting value. The House of Wisdom tradition, the preservation of Aristotle that would eventually help spark the European Renaissance, the medical works of Averroes, the mathematics that gave us algebra. These are documented historical contributions, not romantic mythology. The contrast he was drawing was not about which civilization was superior overall. It was about what was destroyed and why, and what that destruction reveals about the moral framework that authorized it. Now here's what the Crusades represent in Nietzsche's specific argument. The Crusades, particularly in their later iterations, were not primarily defensive operations. They were military campaigns that, at various points, involved the massacre of civilian populations, the sacking of Christian Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204, the burning of libraries, and the destruction of intellectual infrastructure in multiple locations. Nietzsche's point is not that violence is uniquely Christian, or that the Crusades were the worst violence in history. His point is about the moral framework that authorized the violence. The same tradition that instructed its followers that pride was the deadliest sin, that strength and self-assertion were the root of the fall from grace, declared these campaigns holy, called those who participated in them righteous, promised them spiritual reward for what the same framework would have condemned in any other context. The strength that was sin when displayed by the individual believer became virtue when it was deployed in service of institutional expansion. The pride condemned in the sermon was celebrated in the crusading general. The violence prohibited to one man became sacred when it was done by the right men for the right institution. Now here's what I think about this, and I want to be direct. The sharpest observation in Nietzsche's argument is not the historical claim itself. It is what the pattern reveals about how moral frameworks actually function under institutional pressure. Every major institution I can think of, religious or secular, has done exactly this. Condemned in ordinary members the qualities it depended on, and celebrated in its leadership. The military that teaches humility to enlisted soldiers while building monuments to generals. The corporation that preaches teamwork while rewarding the self-assertion of executives. This is not a Christian problem. It is an institutional problem. But Nietzsche's point is that Christianity is not exempt from it by virtue of having made the condemnation explicit in its founding documents. Here is where the argument escalates, And this is the philosophical conclusion the historical evidence supports. The pattern Nietzsche identified is not incidental, it is structural. A moral framework that condemns strength and self-assertion in the governed population, while depending on those qualities in its governing authority, is a moral framework that is performing two different functions simultaneously. The condemnation functions to produce compliance in the population. The exemption functions to concentrate power in the institution. This is not a conspiracy theory. It does not require anyone to have consciously designed it this way. Social structures that reward compliance and sanction individual self-assertion tend to produce exactly this result organically, over time, without any central intention. What Nietzsche was pointing to is that the moral framework of Christianity, which explicitly grounded its condemnation of pride and strength in universal theological truth, was not actually applying that truth universally. It was applying it where application produced compliance, and suspending it where suspension produced institutional power. That is the contradiction. And it is not resolvable by pointing to individual believers who live the framework consistently. The question is about the institutional pattern. The theological defense deserves to be heard fully before we respond to it. Serious Christian historians and theologians do not pretend the Crusades were unambiguously righteous. The tradition has engaged in substantial self-criticism on this history. Pope John Paul II offered formal apology for the Crusades in 2000. Many contemporary Christian scholars argue that the crusading violence was a departure from core Christian values, not an expression of them, that the same tradition that produced the violence also produced the internal critics who condemned it. This is a real argument. It has force, and it is the most serious response to Nietzsche's challenge. Personally, I find the apology argument more revealing than it intends to be. When an institution apologizes for centuries of behavior it authorized, blessed, and rewarded in real time, the apology does not dissolve the pattern, it confirms it. The institution that pronounced the campaigns holy in the 12th century and apologizes for that holiness in the 21st has demonstrated that its moral pronouncements are not stable enough to function as the universal foundation they claim to be. That is precisely Nietzsche's point. The moral framework was being applied contextually, in ways that served the institution's needs at the time. The apology is honest, but it is evidence for his argument, not against it. Now the question is why this matters beyond medieval history. And this is where I want to be specific about the stakes. The pattern Nietzsche identified did not stay inside religious institutions. It transferred, completely intact, into the secular moral frameworks that replaced them. Every political ideology of the 20th century that built a moral framework on the condemnation of individual self-assertion, in the name of the collective, the nation, the class, the movement, produced exactly the same structural result. The qualities condemned in ordinary members were celebrated in leadership. The pride prohibited to the individual was glorified in the cause. This is not an argument that all moral frameworks are equally corrupt. It is an argument that any moral framework can be captured by institutional logic in ways that produce exactly the contradiction Nietzsche found in the Antichrist. You have lived through enough institutions, corporate, political, civic, religious, to recognize this without a philosophical framework to name it. The organization that teaches its members humility while its leadership exercises unconstrained authority. The movement that condemns self-interest in ordinary participants while its leadership operates entirely from self-interest. The framework does the disciplining. The institution does not have to. What Nietzsche was ultimately arguing is not that Christianity should be replaced by something else. His argument is more uncomfortable than that. He was arguing that any moral framework that does not acknowledge the specific contradiction between what it condemns universally and what it exempts institutionally is not operating as a universal moral truth. It is operating as an instrument of social control. The question that leaves you with, and it is a question, not a verdict, is whether the moral framework you have operated inside for the significant portion of your life has been applied to you with the same consistency it applied to the institutional authority above you. In my experience, the honest answer to that question is one of the most clarifying things a person can sit with, not to produce bitterness, to produce clarity about what you actually believe versus what you were required to perform. The distinction matters, especially at this point in life, when the requirement is behind you and what remains is what was actually true the whole time. Tell me where I'm wrong. Comment section is open, and I read every one of them. Subscribe if this actually made you think. Philosophy every week. No fluff, no motivation posters.